The quest of the real self consists in gathering together all the energies of body and mind by banishing all alien thoughts, and then directing all those energies into a single current, namely the resolve to find the answer to the question, who am I? The question may also take the form of whence am I? What am I? Who am I means what is the truth of me? Whence am I means what is the source of the sense of the self in the ego? The source in this quest is to be understood not as some remote ancestor or progenitor in evolution, nor as some being existing before the birth of the body, but as a present source. Someone who seemed to think that it was important to know about his own previous births asked the sage of Arunachala how he could get to know of them. The sage answered, "Why bother about previous births? Find out first if now you have ever been born." In this, as in other idle questions, the ego lurks and manages to sidestep the search for the truth. Really, the self has never been born, so the source is to be sought not in the past, but in the present. This quest is the one sure method of breaking the vicious circle of the three states, for it not only quiets the thinking mind, but prevents it from falling asleep and thereby losing all consciousness. Therefore, it has been described as sleeping watchfully. Neither in ordinary waking, when the mind wanders from thought to thought, nor in sleep, when even the basic consciousness of I am is submerged in a subtle state, can that vicious circle be overpassed. But for an instant of time, in the passage of the mind from the vagrancy of waking to the utter stillness of sleep, the consciousness attains its purity as the formless I am. By the force of the resolve in this quest, consciousness is reduced to and kept steadily in this formless state. And by this, the vicious circle is broken and the egoless state is won. Ramana the sage describes the quest and the method in the following way. Just as one dives into a lake seeking a thing that has fallen in, so should the seeker dive into the heart and be resolved to find wherefrom rises the ego sense by restraining speech and vital breath. This brings out the devotional aspect of the quest. As the diver devotes himself to his purpose, the recovery of the lost article, by restraining the breath and diving with all his weight, so too the seeker must be devoted to finding the real self, the source of the I am in the ego, by the ingathering of all the vital and mental energies and directing them heartwards. The resolve to find the self is the dynamic element in the quest, without which there can be no diving into the heart. And the question, who am I, or whence am I, implies this resolve. To him that so dives, says the sage, success is assured. For then, says the sage, some mysterious force arises from within and takes possession of his mind and takes it straight to the heart. If the seeker be pure of mind and free from love of individuality, he would yield himself unreservedly to this force and get the highest of all rewards. For whatever a man is devoted to, that he gets. And there is nothing higher than Atman, the real self. He that has not this perfect devotion will need to practice the quest repeatedly till the mind becomes pure and strong, or to practice some kind of meditation or devotion to God. Devotion implies renunciation, which means non-attachment to the unreal. So we are taught by the sages. He that is greatly devoted to any one thing is so far indifferent to other things. He that is devoted to the self that is inside is so far indifferent to the world that is outside. Devotion and renunciation are like the two sides of a single metal. They are inseparable. Renunciation strengthens the mind and ensures success in the quest. This we know from common worldly experience, because whoever is devoted to any worldly end renounces of his own accord whatever stands in the way and gains that end. Naturally, renunciation is equally necessary for the winning of the greatest of all gains, the egoless state. But we must see to it that we understand renunciation correctly. It is a purification of the mind, a harmonious and concentrated direction of the mind to the goal, not simply the observance of external forms of self-denial. We were told that speech and the vital breath should be restrained, but the sage explains that the breath does not need to be actively restrained, if the resolve be keen and persistent. For then the breath would automatically be suspended, and the energies hitherto operating in the body indrawn and reunited to the mind, thus enabling it to dive into the heart. This ingathering of the vital energies is essential. For so long as these energies are united to the body, the mind cannot turn away from the body and the world and dive into the heart. When the breathing ceases by the force of the resolve, the mind is no longer aware of the body or the world. The body then becomes almost a corpse. If the seeker has not the needful strength of devotion, so that the breathing does not stop of itself, he is advised to bring about a suspension of the breath by the simple method of watching the breathing process. When this watching is steadily kept up, the breath slows down and finally stops. Then the mind becomes quiet, free from distracting thoughts, and can then be devoted to the quest. As in meditation of any sort, so in the pursuit of this quest, thoughts of surprising variety may arise and distract the mind, and a sense of defeat and discouragement may be felt. The sage tells us that these thoughts arise only to be quelled, and hence there is no need for the seeker of the self to be disheartened or to accept defeat. If it seems that success cannot come in the near future, that it could come only after long delay, the sadhak or spiritual aspirant should meet the thought by remembering that time itself is not real and that the self is not in time. In a book of great antiquity, it is stated that the seeker of the real self must have as much perseverance and patience as is involved in attempting to dry up the ocean by removing from it water drop by drop. In another book, there is a parable of a pair of sparrows whose eggs were washed away by the sea. The birds determined to recover the eggs and punish the sea at the same time by drying it up. This they proceeded to do by repeatedly plunging into the waters and shedding the clinging drops on the shore. The fable says that finally the gods intervened and the eggs were restored. Every alien thought that arises in the quest and is quelled adds to this mind's strength, says the sage, and thus takes the seeker one step nearer to his goal. When the seeker has persisted long enough in the quest, and the power from within has arisen and taken possession of the mind, the heart is quickly reached. That is to say, the mind becomes reduced to the state of pure consciousness and begins to shine steadily in its pure form as the formless I. The sage of Arunachala calls this formless consciousness I am I, or I am that I am, to distinguish it from the ego sense, which has the form of I am this body. That implies the cessation of the ego form. The finite ego is swallowed up by the infinite self. With the finite ego are lost all the imperfections and limitations which beset life. Desire and fear are at an end, as well as sin and accountability. The real self was never subject to these. They belong to the ego, and they do not survive the ego. In the egoless state, the self abides in its own glory. The sage that has thus found the self, having shed the ego, is not an individual, though he may appear as such to immature disciples and to the rest of the world. The sage recommends also meditation of the pure I am, or I, known as aham, as an equivalent of the quest. He says, since his name is I, the sadhaka that meditates on the I is taken to the heart, the world of the real self. How to reconcile devotion to the self with the daily routine of work that the world demands? This question was put to the sage by one who had come from a distant place by rail, and the sage replied as follows. Why do you think you are active? Take the case of your coming here. You left home in a cart, took your seat in a train, alighted at the Tiruvannamalai station, again got into a cart, and found yourself here. When asked, you say that you came here from your own town. But is it true? As a matter of fact, you remained as you were. Only the conveyances moved and changed. Just as these movements are taken as yours, so also are the other activities. They are not yours. They are God's activities. The questioner objected that such an attitude will simply lead to blankness of mind and work will come to a standstill. And so the sage replied further, go up to that blankness and then tell me. From this, we may understand that to the extent we realize that the self is not the doer, it is not necessary for the earnest seeker to retire from his worldly activities, that is, to become a recluse or hermit, in order to prosecute this quest. He may just allow the mind and the senses to do their work automatically, remembering that he himself is not the doer. All the time he may be active in the quest or in meditation, just as one thinks while walking. Not only is it unnecessary to renounce one's everyday activities, to become a recluse or hermit, in order to take up this quest, but it would appear from what the sage has actually said that it may be desirable for most of us to continue to be active in order to prepare for the quest. The sage tells us that dissolution of the mind in the self is accomplished by steadily cultivating the knowledge that the mind is but a phantom of the self, and that this can be done while going through one's everyday activities. These activities can thus be utilized as a preparation for the quest. When this knowledge that the mind is but a phantom of the real self is firmly established, then it will be easy to take to the quest and persist in it watchfully to the very end. Many times the question was raised before the sage whether or not it is necessary to renounce house and family ties and fare forth as a mendicant ascetic. The sage has said that if one be fated to become an ascetic, the question will not arise, but that as a rule it is not necessary. And on one occasion there was a short dialogue where a visitor asked, "Should I leave home or may I remain there?" And the sage of Arunachala said, "Are you in the house or is the house in you? You should remain just where you are even now. You cannot go away from that." And the man replied, "So I may remain at home?" And the sage said, "I did not say so. Listen carefully. You should remain steadfast just in that place which is naturally yours always." The questioner put the question assuming that he was in the house, but the truth is that the whole world is in him as the real self. So he was told to remain in the self, that is, to cease to think that the world is real. On another occasion, the sage said, "A householder who does not think, 'I am a householder,' is a true ascetic, while an ascetic who thinks, 'I am an ascetic,' is not. The self is neither an ascetic nor a householder." It may be remarked that the assumption of an ascetic mode of life is a serious affair. And the sage points out that in any case it is the mind that has to be harmonized to the quest, and if it cannot be done at home, it would be equally difficult elsewhere. The great power for good which the disciple must utilize wherever possible is the society of sages, the satsanga. The sacred lore seems to use even the language of hyperbole in recommending this. The sage cites these texts freely. The extent to which one would be benefited depends on one's understanding of and devotion to the sage as guru. Such devotion is of great importance, as we shall see in a later chapter. An important caution to the disciple is given in a minor work attributed to the sage Shankara, and this is adopted by the sage of Arunachala when he said, "One should inwardly reflect on the truth of non-duality always, but should not seek to apply the teaching in his actions. Meditation on non-duality is proper in respect of all the three worlds, but understand that it should not be done in respect of the Guru." It may be difficult to make out the reason for these injunctions, but if we remember the power of the ego to pervert and frustrate even honest efforts to realize the truth, which would mean its own death, we need not be puzzled. Reflection on the truth of Advaita tends to dissolve the ego and develop devotion to the truth. But the action from the Advaitic standpoint is suicidal, because the enemy would be in charge of such action. While ignorance is alive, duality persists in appearing as real because of the ego sense, and truly Advaitic action is impossible. The sage alone can put Advaita into action because he is egoless. Hence the sacred lore and also the sage advise us to restrict our activities and not to extend them, so as to give as little scope as possible for the ego to frustrate our efforts. Herein it will be useful to remember that a theoretical knowledge of the self does not destroy the ego, which is the enemy within us. Devotion to the Guru as God incarnate is proper and necessary, as we shall see shortly. Until one becomes egoless, therefore, it would be unwise to try to look upon the Guru as oneself, because the actual result will be something quite different. It will result in believing oneself to be the equal of the Guru. To be really one with the Guru is to be egoless. Hence the caution not to imagine non-difference with the Guru. The following cautions and instructions are from the Guru Ramana Vachanamala. Forgetting the self is verily death. Therefore, for him that is out to conquer death by the quest, the one rule to fulfill is not to forget. Since even one's own activities are a cause of forgetting the self, is it necessary to say that he that is engaged in the quest of the self should not engage in the work of other people? Though there are numerous observances, the rule of regulated eating is alone sufficient for the true devotee or sadhaka, because it augments the sattvic quality. The rule of food regulation is that one should allow time for the stomach's rest, and when hungry, eat a limited amount of sattvic food. Until the ego dies, humility alone is good for the sadhaka, and he should never accept homage done to him by others. The pot sinks because it takes in water. Timber floats because it does not. So he that is attached becomes bound, and he that is not bound, even if he is in the house. One should overcome misfortunes with faith, courage, and serenity, remembering that they come by God's grace in order to give strength. For one that is devoted to the highest, it is better to be in a worldly condition to be pitied by men than in one that would cause envy. Indifference all around, with the mind serene, without desire and without hate, is the beautiful way of life for the true devotee. What is called fate is nothing but actions done by oneself previously. Hence, fate can be wiped off by suitable effort. What is done with peaceful and pure mind is righteous action. Whatever is done with the mind agitated and filled with desire is wrong action. To be unattached and at peace, resigning all burden to God Almighty, is the highest austerity, or tapas. As the grains that remain at the base of the pivot in a hand mill are not crushed, so those that have taken refuge in God are unaffected even by great misfortunes. As the magnetic needle swerves not from the north, so those that have their minds devoted to God do not swerve from the right path through illusion. Never give way to anxiety, thinking, when shall I attain this state? It is beyond space and time, and therefore it is neither far nor near. Pervading everything by its own nature, the self is ever free. How can it be bound by Maya, by illusion? So do not give way to despair. The notion I am an unstable soul has arisen by letting go of one's immovable nature. The spiritual aspirant, the true devotee, should cast off this notion and rest in the supreme silence. This is the device for overcoming the capricious nature of the mind. Look upon all that is perceived and on the perceiver as the real self. Just as a thorn that is used for taking out another thorn should be thrown aside, so a good thought that is useful for driving out an evil thought should also be given up. As one dives into the sea with a heavy stone and takes out pearls, so one should dive with non-attachment into the heart and gain the self. The quest of the real self is fundamentally different from all the methods of winning deliverance which are in vogue. These are known as yogas. 4 of them are generally known, namely the yogas of action, of devotion, of mind control, and right understanding. The sage compares these 4 with the quest in the following way. The quest, who is he to whom belongs actions, separateness from God, ignorance, or separateness from reality, is itself the yogas of action, of devotion, of right understanding, and of mind control. That is the true state of the self, the untainted and blissful experience of one's own self, where the seeker, the I being extinct, these 8 have no place. Here it is made clear that in the 4 yogas, the follower takes the ego to be himself, and thus attributes to the self some one or other of the defects that appear in himself because of the conclusion. The yogi of action takes it that the self is the doer of actions and is thus bound to suffer their effects. He wants to neutralize these actions by other actions. The yogi of devotion is persuaded that he is other than God and needs to become united to God by devotion. The yogi of right understanding thinks that the self is in ignorance and wants to remove that ignorance. The yogi of mind control thinks that the self is separated from reality and seeks reunion by mind control. These are wrong assumptions, because there is no individual soul, because the whole world order is an illusion. When the real self is sought and found, it will be found that the self was never bound, but is ever perfect. The seeker of the self starts with this knowledge. When by the quest the ego dies, it will be seen that neither these 4 defects nor the 4 remedies for them have any place in the egoless state, which alone is real. The sage of Arunachala once told this writer that the quest is the great yoga, Maha Yoga, or Mahat, which means awareness. It is the great awareness. And the reason is that, as shown here, all the yogas are included in the quest.